when was the last time that 3 weeks in a row, it seems, there are negative headlines coming out of Columbus? You've got obviously, I can't remember what his first name is. Pope, right? Was
Yes,
dismissed
Kevon
from the
Pope.
team. He was dismissed from the team. Last week it was, Kerry Coombs. They don't know who's calling the defense. The prior week they lose to Oregon. Has there been a time where 3 weeks in a row it's some type of negativity coming out of Columbus?
I want to say no because of the results on the field, but I'm sure I could find a span of time
Right.
over the last 10 years in which there was, just because of this type of alarmist type attitude. But different headlines, as you noted, different headlines. I would point to 2018. It'd be a constant drain on the defense not being as
Right.
good as it should have been. But and they really were in a situation against Akron on Saturday where, of course, regardless of what you do, you can't win public perception. You could win 100-0. It didn't matter. But in regards to what they needed to do, apparently because of CJ Stroud's shoulder at the quarterback position, because if Kyle McCord comes in and lights it up, and he played fairly well. I haven't looked at the game to see, how much of it was him standing there in the pocket for 17 seconds with,
Right.
Nothing to do versus actually needing to make plays with a little bit of pressure in his face. But you really can't win that situation from a public standpoint, because if McCord plays great, then you got a quarterback controversy. If he plays poorly, then it's like, well, they all are horrible. That none of them can play. What are we going to do?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting too. I mean, just not at least having Stroud go in and play a quarter or something like that. I don't know the severity of his injury or what's going on there, but you are putting yourself in a situation to have a QE controversy, especially with how Stroud has played. Not great in some situations. So now, how do you think about the depth at that quarterback position now? I think, do you know that, what's his name? Johnny Bullitt. He's an Ohio State guy on Twitter. I've done a couple things with him. But he came out and tweeted it. I believe he said, it's very clear that Ohio State has 3 quarterbacks that are better than anybody on Michigan's roster. Do you believe that, or are you not bought into the depth that quite yet?
I think that I would feel, if I had a rock solid running game and I felt secure that the running game was going to be 70% of the offense, I would, based on what I've seen with Cade McNamara, I would feel more confident with him running the offense than I would CJ Stroud. But I haven't had to see Cade McNamara throw the ball 54 times against Oregon and trailing in that game most of the time. So I don't know, because CJ Stroud, while there was an L in the win-loss column at the end of the game, it wasn't like he was a complete failure in that game. He threw a costly interception late, but he threw 1 pick in 54 attempts and threw for 484 yards. So I don't know that Cade McNamara can do that, although he did that against Rutgers last year in kind of a 3-quarter drill where he had to bring him back from 17 down. So he was kind of in that mode to a certain extent and pulled through. What I took, Justin, from Saturday was, I didn't watch much of the Michigan-Rutgers first half. I watched most of the second half because it got interesting. It wasn't the most scintillating game I've ever seen, but it got interesting from the standpoint of, can Rutgers make one play? Could they tie this game?
Yeah.
Can they do something? And they were moving the ball a little bit. So my thought was, I still think Rutgers is probably the worst team in this division. Could this be what we're going to see? This will be fascinating. If I still think Ohio State has the biggest probability of breaking away from the pack, just being a different team in a couple of weeks, and okay, they're back to normal and they're running through the division and they're the best. Totally. I think Michigan and Penn State would have the next probability of being, okay, this is Michigan's year or this is Penn State's year and they're the best team and they're pretty much going to go through the division with 0 losses or maybe get tripped up once and they'll win the division. But if things don't change and we see what we saw Michigan Rutgers, we see Ohio State struggling, like everybody could beat everybody. Like all 7 of them, like I don't know what the math is on 7 teams playing each other once, what 35 games, something in that range, but we could have like 35 like crazy games and never know. Maryland, Michigan State, who's going to win that game? Maryland, Ohio State, Indiana, Penn State, who's going to win that game? Nobody knows week to week.
I mean, it is crazy. We talked about this last week where it's like that. Last week we said there's a top, what do we say, 4 or something, then another layer. Now, I don't know if there's a top 4. I really don't. It is like pretty much, at least in the Big Ten East, for sure. I think everybody in the East is like very capable of beating, a lot of teams there. Now I think the question too is, do we need to rearrange these divisions? Because the Big Ten West outside of Iowa is not good. Minnesota lost to Bowling Green. I mean, Purdue's the only other team that's 1-0 in that division, and so I totally agree. We could see a lot of different things happen in the next 4 weeks, let's call it, between Michigan having to go play some really good teams. Michigan State, are they for real, or they almost blew it against Nebraska on Saturday too, or so maybe they're not. Maryland is little Tua all of a sudden a stud, and are they like serious contender, or are we overreacting in the early stages? Penn State, they've already got some great wins on their schedule. Does Ohio State go do what you said, where we're all kind of expecting it? At what point do they just figure it out? Because we all think it's going to happen eventually. And then you look at Rutgers. They're not a bad team. They're I don't think they're a good team, but they're solid. And then at some point, the only team I've not talked about in the East is Indiana, who was the contender for the East Division last year until they lost to Ohio State in the last few minutes of that game. So it's gonna be really crazy to watch what happens, but it might be like everybody just beats everybody, like you just said.
If you were going to ask me who I'm most confident in having a good season, and by definition, that would be, let's say 9-3 minimum, I would say Penn State. I have the most confidence. I don't think they're going to come off the rails and be bad. But if you said one of these teams is going to win a college football playoff game, I'd say Ohio State.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. I agree with that statement for sure. I just can't. I'm sorry, I can't take James Franklin seriously in a big stage game. Once it comes down to it, it's like I'm always thinking in the fourth quarter, how is James Franklin going to screw this up with timeouts or with something going on? He somehow always figures that out. But I mean, you do look. I agree with you. 9-3, I think, could be a great Penn State. That would be a great year for them, though, with wins over Auburn and Wisconsin. They still have to play Iowa. They've got to play Ohio State. They've got to play Michigan. They've got to play Michigan State. They've had a tough schedule already. They still have a lot to go on that schedule. Whereas I look at Ohio State's schedule, and it's not that bad comparatively. They've got to play Michigan and Michigan State. They do have to play Penn State, but I agree. I have to just expect as a Michigan fan that Ohio State's going to figure it out at some point, and if I had to guess, it's probably going to be like November 26th. They'll figure it out somehow. And it'll put it all together for that game in Ann Arbor.
And Michigan State's somewhat fascinating too, because they're back to being kind of like a Mark D'Antonio Michigan State. They can run the ball, got one of the best backs in the nation, sturdy defense, not ultra talented, but they're in the right position, make the right plays, make the tackles. And the Nebraska game can be determined as, whoa, Michigan State's coming back down to earth. They barely beat Nebraska. They had a Michigan kind of second half in that game where they pretty much couldn't do anything, couldn't move the ball, couldn't do anything, and hung on. Or you can see it as, you know what? They're coming off this big win against Miami. They come home, could have been a trap game, and that's one of the marks of a team that has one of those kind of seasons where they're going to have those 2 or 3. We didn't play well. We really couldn't do anything, but we found a way.
Totally. And I think you have to chalk it up that Nebraska has been playing pretty well the last 8 quarters of football, right? And so that offense is moving. I still think Scott Frost. I don't get Scott Frost either, because he's screwed up some things too, where it's like that was a totally winnable football game for Nebraska. And they, the punt return, and like it's just like little mistakes that his team is making. He actually, in the post-game press conference, blamed his players for not being bought in or being solid. And I'm like, dude, you're in year 4 of your program. That's on you then if you can't have your guys, bought in. But yeah, Michigan State's going to be all of a sudden. Michigan fans had that one October 30th all off season as totally a win. They're going to go into Sparty and not, have a problem. All of a sudden, I could see Michigan State being favored in that game for sure. So, yeah, all in all, this Big Ten is going to be – we said it last week. I bet you we say it again next week. It's going to be fun, and we don't know what's going to happen. But I think, to finalize here what Michigan looked like too, I don't want to overreact to one half of football compared to the last 3.5 games. Yes, I think that they struggled in that half against Rutgers to end it, but I don't think it was because of a talent issue or they got dominated. I think it was just you're up 20-3 at home. It's homecoming. You're 3-0. You take the foot off the gas, and all of a sudden you find yourself in one of those games. And so I'm not going to chalk it up to that. Oh, all of a sudden Michigan can't run the ball anymore. My bet is that they try again next week. I hope that they have a plan B at least if it doesn't work against that great Wisconsin front. But I still think this is a really solid Michigan team, and I still think that they're going to be, in a good position to be contending at least for a good stretch here.
We talk Michigan football in the Big Ten with Justin Rowe each and every week, but you can catch even more there. Blue by 90 podcast and at Justin Rowe 92. Justin, it's been fun. Appreciate it. Enjoy the game this weekend.
Appreciate it. Thanks, man. Have a good one.